We've been in a series called Don't At Me. And what we've been talking about is that Jesus, whether you believe he was God, Son of God or not, whether you trust him or follow this whole Christianity thing, he was a real person, and he had some statements that were kind of don't at me statements. He would say things to people, to crowds of people, sometimes just in the middle of a conversation. He would say these things, and there were things that you couldn't really argue with. There was no comeback to them. There was no debating them. It was over. And the reason we've been talking about these is because Jesus had a lot of things to say about himself. In fact, there were 7 things in the Bible that he says, I am, and then you fill in the blank. And we've been covering those things. And the reason we want to cover them is because what someone says about themselves matters. When someone says something about themselves, one, if it's true, you want to know, but also what someone decides to talk about when they're talking about themselves really reveals a lot about who they are. We all have that friend or we know that person that talks way too much about the things that they say they're good at, but they're really not, right? And it reveals a lot of things about them. And so Jesus had a lot of things to say about himself. And like for instance, if you and I were talking and I decided to tell you that I could dunk. Now, if you have ever played basketball with me, you know that that is a joke and I cannot dunk. And maybe just looking at me on the stage, you would go, that can't happen. You would ask me to back it up, right? Look at your neighbor and say, back it up. If someone says something about themselves, they've got to back it up. Look at your other neighbor and say, back it on up. Now, the cool thing about Jesus is he backed it up. Everything that he said about himself wasn't just empty words. It wasn't just statements that he said and they never proved. Jesus backed it up. And he had a lot of interesting things to say. And the kind of things that he said are things that if they are true, they change everything. Like Jesus wasn't just saying, getting Chick-fil-A without pickles, as I say every week, is insanity, right? He wasn't saying something like that. Jesus wasn't saying things like trying to debate on whether TikTok is the dumbest or the coolest thing ever. Like he wasn't saying these things, right? He wasn't saying these things that don't really necessarily matter. Like the things that Jesus was saying, if they are true, they changed everything. And so it's good to know that Jesus wasn't just full of empty words, that Jesus actually chose to back up what he said. And so tonight, one of the ones that we're diving into is perhaps maybe the biggest one. We're still going to cover some more after this week, but this one, if this statement is true, back in that time and today, it literally can change everything if you decide to latch on that what Jesus said about himself is true. And this statement that Jesus said, and like I said, if you don't follow God, you don't believe in this whole church thing, we're still pumped that you're here. Jesus was historically a real person. The debate is whether he was the Son of God or not. And we believe that he was. And this statement that he says in this story that we're going to read tonight is the one that is the biggest. That if it is true, it could literally change your life if you decide to latch onto it. And it's sandwiched right in the middle of a story that a lot of you have heard. Even if you're not a Christian, some of you have heard this story. And if you grew up in church, you've definitely heard this story. And so we're going to jump right into the middle of the story. And just like my favorite movies, we're going to see kind of the middle, and then we're going to see how we got there. And so it's going to be in John chapter 11, starting in verse 25. And if you have a Bible, you can turn there. If it's on your phone, whatever. If not, it's going to be up on the screen. But we're going to dive right into the middle of this thing and see this statement that Jesus says about himself. And then we're going to kind of backtrack and see why he was saying it. So here's what Jesus says in John chapter 11, verse 25 through 26. Jesus told her, we're going to find out who her was later, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. And then he reveals who this her was. It says, do you believe this, Martha? And I mean, just visualize it like it's a movie. It cuts on, right at the beginning. Jesus makes this statement, and then here's Jesus standing with this woman, and he says, do you believe that? And then it goes black. And then we've got to figure out, how did we get to this moment? Now, that's a pretty big claim, right? This area that Jesus was in was very highly religious. It was a country and a nation where everyone in some way was pretty religious when it came to following this God that was the God of Israel. And what these people knew was that one day this person was going to come who was going to claim he was going to be the Son of God, and he was going to be able to bring freedom and life to all of these people. And so when Jesus, this guy walking around claiming to be the Son of God, makes this statement, it's a really big deal. Not just for today, but also way back in this time when it was said. Because if Jesus is claiming, this man Jesus, claiming to be the Son of God, is now saying, listen, I'm the resurrection and the life. That's a huge deal because he's claiming two things. The last one is that, listen, I'm the way to life we talked about last week. You want to have full life, you want to know what life is like, live to the max, you've got to follow me, and that is what you're going to have. But then he makes another statement, and it's maybe the bigger one, that he's the resurrection. And that word may seem weird or like antiquated and religious, but really what he's saying is, not only am I the life, anything that's dead I can bring to life. And the reason why what he was saying would have left many confused during this time is what this story is wrapped up in. And so we're going to start the beginning and kind of see where we're at and why Jesus is looking at this woman and asking, do you really believe that? And so we start off, and the first sentence of this, many of you are going to figure out what story it is, and it's going to be at the very beginning of John 11. So here's what happens. A man named Lazarus was sick, and he lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. Now let's take inventory here, and you can leave the verse up, but we're going to pause for a minute. We've got three characters here that we're seeing. Lazarus, this man who apparently is very sick, we're going to learn, and his two sisters, Mary and Martha. Now, this is not Mary like Jesus married. This is a different Mary. But what we learn in the next verse, if you'll go to it, this is the Mary who later poured expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. So we're going to refer to her from here forward as Hairy Mary. So Hairy Mary was in a very famous story in the Bible where this woman comes and opens up this expensive perfume that was about a year's wages. Like, that's expensive cologne, y'all. That's expensive. Breaks it, pours it out on Jesus. A lot of people get mad, and the writers want us to know, like, listen, this is that Mary. This is before she did all of that. So we got Lazarus. We're going to call him Laz. Look at your neighbor and say Laz. We're going to call him Laz. And we got Hairy Mary and Martha. And Lazarus is sick. Mary and Martha are the sisters to Lazarus. And it says her brother Lazarus was sick. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend is very sick. Now, this is important because we learned something in that last sentence, that Jesus knows Lazarus. And not only does he know Lazarus, but they're able to say, like, your close friend, your best friend, this person you care about so deeply. In fact, some versions of the Bible that you read will say the one you love, like the one you care about so much, he is sick. And we don't know maybe what Mary and Martha believe at this time, what Lazarus believed about Jesus. Maybe they were still trying to figure it out. Maybe they were like totally on board. This dude's the Son of God. But no doubt they've heard like everything that Jesus has done. Like, there's no Instagram and Snapchat, and so Jesus isn't making TikToks about his healings and the miracles that he's doing. But they no doubt have heard that Jesus is performing all of these miracles, right? And so in this moment when Lazarus is sick, Mary and Martha decide they're going to send a message to Jesus, hearing that Jesus has healed people, maybe even seeing it happen. And they go, listen, like, Jesus, the dude, your really good friend, Laz, hey, yo, it's Hairy Mary. Listen, Lazarus is sick. Your dear friend is sick. And we don't hear the rest of the letter. Maybe it just said that because maybe they were assuming that when Jesus hears this, everything's going to be good. Like Jesus is going to come, it's going to be great. But here's what ends up happening in the next set of verses. It says, but when Jesus heard about it, he said to his disciples, people around him, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God, him, will receive glory from this. So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Finally, he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. Now, this bothers me a little bit, and maybe it bothers you. Because we know that Jesus cares about Lazarus. We know that his sisters have sent word to Jesus, hey, Lazarus is sick. And then it says, but even though Jesus cared about these people, he decided to stay where he was for 2 more days. And what we learn is that Lazarus dies during one of those days. And after he dies, then Jesus decides it's time to go back. Now, let's just take a poll in the room. Whether you believe in God or not, wherever you're at, how many of you that bothers you just a little bit? You can be honest. My hand's up. I'm by example, like, hey, that bothers me. I mean, the fact is that Jesus hears that Lazarus is sick, and then he decides to chill out for 2 days. Like he hears that someone he cares about, up before this point, he's healed people before, and Jesus hears this, and then he decides to chill out for 2 days and not do anything about it. And it even says, even though he loved these people, he decided not to do anything. And this is where the tension of this story comes in if you really decide to read it like it actually happened, because it did. Is that we don't know why Lazarus was sick. What he had could have been anything. I mean, maybe it's Lazarus' fault that he's sick. Maybe like Mary and Martha, every time they're eating dinner, they're like, Lazarus, wash your hands. They're disgusting. And he never washes his hands, and now he's sick, and it's his fault. Or maybe he was in a terrible skateboarding accident because maybe he skateboards. I don't know. Lazarus sounds like a dude that would skateboard. And so maybe he broke something. I don't know. Maybe he was being dumb. He did something. Maybe it was outside of his control. But here's the deal. If we really believe that God can change anything, like God could fix any situation, Jesus could like come into whatever's going on in your life and change it. Like he totally has the ability to do that. But we also have something called free will. And for God to change something in our lives, wouldn't that then mean that he has to override our choices? And so it gets messy in this spot. Because maybe Lazarus's bad choices, maybe Lazarus's like deciding not to do certain things led to him being sick. We don't know, but maybe it did. And Jesus now intervening is really just cutting Lazarus's free will off, because you and I all want God to not intervene in our lives when it comes to good things, when everything's going great. Usually the only time we ask God to change something is when it's bad. Like no one wins the lottery and is like, God, why? Like, why did you do this? Like why, right? No one's doing that. When it's bad things is when we go, God, I need you to change this. Even things that we cause in our own lives. Now, the truth is, you and I have good and bad things happen to us all the time, both that we cause and that we don't cause. And in this messy area where you and I make our own decisions, but God is still this God that can change anything in your life in a second if he chooses to, it creates this kind of tension. Because we all have had moments in our lives, maybe we're in one right now, or we see it coming, where there is something that either we're about to get ourselves into or that's going to happen to us that's outside of our control, that we're going to want God to change. That we're going to pray and we're going to ask for God to intervene, to change it, to fix it, to flip it around. And the question is, how does all of this work? And so I don't know all of the answers to this. I don't know if it was Lazarus' fault that he was sick. I don't know if it just happened because of natural stuff. But what we know is that there were two very real people who were related to Lazarus who believed that Jesus could change things. And they asked him to change it. And nothing happened. So the question tonight is, have you ever felt like that? Whether you believe in God or not, have you ever felt like you've asked, you've pleaded, you've tried, you've believed, and it hasn't happened? I know I have. And so the story doesn't necessarily turn around right away. Here's what happens in the next set of verses, starting in 17. It says, when Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. Like people came, but Jesus didn't. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, when Jesus was on his way, she went to meet him. But Mary stayed at the house. And Martha said to Jesus, and I want you to read this like you're Martha. You're Martha, your brother's sick. You trusted that Jesus could change it. You sent word that the person he cares about, who you care about, is sick. He did nothing, and you're coming out to meet him. He's late. People who aren't Jesus have even made it there before he did, and you're walking out to meet him. Because sometimes when I've read this, I've read it as if, like, Martha's happy to see Jesus, and for some reason I feel like maybe she was a little upset. And so Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had only been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. Yes, Martha said, he'll rise when everyone else rises on the last day. And Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Here we are. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me will never, ever die. Do you believe this, Martha? So here's how we got here. We got to this place where Jesus is explaining to this woman who asked Jesus to heal her brother, and Jesus didn't do it, if she believes that Jesus can do it. And that seems confusing because here's the question. Is God someone who cares about what happens to me, whether I caused it or not? I feel like that's what Martha's wondering. Like, is Jesus someone who actually cares about what I'm going through, whether I got myself into it or not? Because to be honest, sometimes I feel like if I got myself into it, Jesus is just standing back going, look what you did, way to go. And then sometimes I feel like if it happened to me and I didn't cause it, then maybe he's a little more forgiving. But what's troubling is God the kind of God, is Jesus the kind of God who would say, whether you got yourself into it or not, whatever it may be, that I care enough about it and I can change it? I mean, that's what I want to know. And if this Jesus guy is real, isn't that what we all want to know? If Jesus can do what he said he can do, if he can change something from death to life, if he can come into our situations and change it, if he can do everything that he said he can do, then the question is, when he doesn't do it, why didn't he do it? Is there a bigger plan? Does he still care about me if things don't change? And Mary and Martha are probably in this spot. And I wonder how many of you in here maybe are right now praying for something and you feel like Mary and Martha. Nothing's happened. You're asking, you're praying, you're doing everything that like every podcast, YouTube sermon, pastor, church service has ever told you to do. And you feel like you're in this spot where Jesus shows up late. Why did he show up late? Why did he let Lazarus die? I mean, wouldn't it have been easier to heal something than resurrect something? And so here's what we see Jesus do. In verse 33, it says, when Jesus saw her weeping, because right before this, Martha looks at Jesus and says, yes, I believe you can do it. And then she walks off crying, and I wonder how long she stood there waiting for Jesus to do it, and he still didn't do anything. And so now she's off crying, other people wailing with her, and a deep anger welled up in him, and he was deeply troubled. Where have you put him, he asked. They told him, Lord, come and see. And then Jesus wept. Obviously, Jesus cares about this situation if he's crying for what's happened. And then the people who were standing by said, see how much they loved him. And then here's maybe the question you've been asking. But some said, this man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? And maybe you've seen a million other people around you, people in your school who you would, at least inside of you, say that they deserve way less than what you deserve, or they're not even doing what God's asked them to do, or they're off on the deep end, and it seems like everything they're wanting is happening, and you're over here going, if God can do that, why can't he just change this? And so here's what ends up happening. Jesus, in the middle of all of this stuff, he's trying to deal with two sisters who were bothered by the fact that they asked him to change something and it didn't happen, and he shows up late talking about how he could do it. They're confused. They don't get what's going on, and Jesus is saying all of these things, and he walks up and he says to them, roll the stone aside. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible. And Jesus responded, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me. But I said it out loud for the sake of all of these standing here, so that they will believe you sent me. Then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out with his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth, and Jesus told them, unwrap him and let him go. So it turns out good, right? Jesus gets to this spot where he resurrects Lazarus, and the question that's asked is, obviously, Lazarus was in heaven before this. That's got to kind of stink to be Lazarus, doesn't it? I heard someone talk about this weekend, like he's up in heaven, everything's great, and then all of a sudden someone's like, hey, Laz, gotta send you back down, bro. But the question is, why would Jesus let him die? It's troubling, and I don't like it. Like, I don't like the fact that Jesus just let it happen. Here's the thing I don't understand, and the thing I've tried to figure out, and the thing I've tried to get to, is that I've heard so many people tell stories about their lives and how they came to know Jesus, or how God helped them through something. And something that I've heard a lot of them say, and something that I've even caught myself saying, is I wouldn't have had it happen any other way. Almost that they say something to the tune of, I'm glad it happened. Like they'll talk about their story, all the trials that they went through, all the hard stuff that happened to them, all the stuff that God walked them through. They'll talk about the times that they didn't understand what was going on, and then they'll be on the other side and they'll look back and they'll go, I wouldn't have changed it. It was terrible. It was awful. But I know something now, and I'm different than I was over there. I wouldn't have it any other way. What if Jesus didn't heal Lazarus because he wanted 2,000 years later us in Noonan, Georgia to know that he could bring him back to life? And this weekend, we celebrate something that is exactly that. This weekend, we celebrate the fact that there is a man who claimed to be a God, the Son of God, who died this Friday, but then this Sunday was nowhere to be found in the grave they put him in. And Jesus decides in this moment to say, you need to know that I'm the resurrection. And then maybe people are thinking, well, you need to back it up, right? And then Jesus goes, just wait. And I've wondered this so many times, and I've had people ask me this. Couldn't God have just in a moment snapped his fingers and said that everyone's forgiven, that everyone can come to know me? And the answer is yes. Then why did he choose to do it through his son being crucified? And the answer is the same reason he let Lazarus die, is so that you and I today could know that God can do so much more than you really think he can. Because if you and I are honest, we read these stories, we read about Jesus on the cross, and we get moved by it in a minute, but does our lives actually model and actually demonstrate that there is a God who can resurrect anything? I don't know if it does. And without Lazarus dying, without Jesus on the cross, without him being dead for 3 days and then rising, we could never fully understand how much God really loves every single person in this room and every person in this world. And it begs the question then, would we have it any other way? There's a lot of things that I've talked about. I've talked about how my parents went through a divorce, and I've talked about how it's made me a better person, though. There are so many people that I've been able to talk to. Some of you in this room who have parents who have gone through divorce. And to be honest, you and I understand each other in that struggle in a way that people who have real happy families just don't get. And when I think back of all the people that I've been able to talk to, even some of you whose parents are not divorced, but they fight all the time, like, I get it. And when I think back at all the people I've been able to talk to and how I've been able to help them see God in the situation, when I think back, I don't know if I'd have it any other way. My father, who I've told y'all so many times was an alcoholic, came to know Jesus. One of the things I sat down and talked with him about was the fact that his name was known in our city as a bad man with a bad reputation. And when he accepted Jesus, they put his name on a billboard that he was getting baptized because they knew no one would ever believe it. And he would look back, and he's told me before, I wouldn't have changed anything because of the people I'm able to talk to. And about 2 summers ago, I was at summer camp in Panama City. And some of you were there. And I was talking to a student. And the main thing that I was asking him about, main thing I was talking to him about, was the fact that his maturity was so much beyond his age. Like he functioned and trusted God so much and was so just following after Jesus, ready for whatever he wanted, and just his maturity level was like twice his age. And I sat down and I was talking to him, and I just straight up said, why are you like this? Why do you think that you are so different? And it wasn't like building him up. He wasn't bragging. But I go, why do you think that you are so much farther along? Why is it that you seem like you have so much together? And he told me the most heartbreaking story. And I remember so much of it. And he talked about when him and his mom lived with his dad and his grandparents, and his mom's mom was just physically beaten by the grandfather. Like I mean hard. Like to the point where they fled and moved to another state. And he proceeded to talk about how just he was young, but he remembers it so vividly and how it messed him up. And how he has a sibling who wants nothing to do with church and is just running off the opposite direction. And then he talked about how even now, I don't know if my family's ever going to stay together. And he told story after story, and none of them had good endings. Like there wasn't this Lazarus moment where my parents fought, but now they love each other and they go to Disney World together. Like none of that happened. And he keeps telling story after story after story after story. And then he goes, but it's made me so much more realize what a life without Jesus can look like. And he said, so I've decided that I don't want to be that. And he said, to be honest, if I hadn't seen that, hadn't had a family that was like that, I wouldn't have made that decision, I don't think. And I wouldn't be where I am. And so he said, I'm kind of glad it happened the way it did, because it made me who I am, and I'll never go down that road. I'm glad it happened. I don't claim to know everything about how does this work, where God has a plan and then we have the free will to choose and do whatever we want. And when are these times where God's going to go, I have something bigger. I'm not going to let you ruin it. I'm going to fix that. I'm going to resurrect that in your life. I'm going to change that. And when does he let us go off the deep end? And may I maybe suggest that maybe God will at some point let us wander the wrong direction, because that's what we're choosing, to show us just how far he can bring us back. And that's the story of the cross. That's the story of this Sunday. That's the story of this Friday, which is that man chose the wrong thing over and over, and Jesus decided, I'm coming and I'm dying for them anyway. Because God, Jesus, did not choose for humanity to ever run away from him. But we did. And we still do today. Even if you know him, you run away sometimes. You choose the wrong things. And he never made us do that. But he chose to die so that we could know him anyway. And the God that you and I, most of you, a lot of you in here, follow, the God that I believe in, and the God that I've decided to devote my life to stand up and tell you guys about him every single week, is the God that can resurrect anything. He just may not do it in the time that we think. A lot of you have dreams that God's placed on your heart, and because of addictions or bad relationships, it's died. A lot of you had this personality that God just wanted to use in crazy ways, and you were going to lead people, but because someone hurt you or because you got yourself into a mess, it's died. He can bring it back. The question he wants to ask today is the same thing he asked Martha, and it's the first verse we read, which is, do you really believe that I can do that? And I believe the best life you and I could ever live is a life that goes, I believe Jesus can do everything he said that he can do, because he backed it up on a cross 2,000 years ago. I believe he's the way. I believe he's the life. I believe he's the resurrection. I believe he wants to know you today. And the question maybe you're still wondering is, why did he let him die? I think we answered it. He wanted to show you in this room today that if he can do that, surely he can forgive you, because the truth is, a lot of you believe you've done too much, you've gone too far, or you're not worth saving. Listen, it couldn't be further from the truth. He wants to know you. He wants a relationship with you. And to the Christian in this room who's lost sight of that, I think we all need to answer that question tonight. Do we really believe that God can do what he said he can